everyone, and thanks so much for joining this APQC On Demand webinar. Today, we're going to talk about trends and best practices for knowledge transfer. And knowledge transfer is really a perennial hot topic for knowledge management programs and teams. And today, we're going to look at why it's particularly important right now and what some key elements are to getting it right. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lauren Trees, and I lead the Knowledge Management Research Program for APQC. And today we're not just going to focus on one big research project. We're going to pull from a couple of different research pieces. We're going to look at some of our trends and priorities research, as well as our Excellence in Knowledge Management series, where we really go dig deep into mature CAM programs and understand how they got there and what makes them work. And also probably some bits and bobs of other research we've done over the years where we've looked at CAM programs with a real knowledge transfer focus or angle. So a little bit of everything today, but really focused on those knowledge transfer best practices and contextualizing that. This is our agenda, pretty simple. We're going to start with how knowledge transfer fits into KM trends, why it's important, why you should care about it. And then we're going to look at 5 steps for excellent knowledge transfer, really focused on what we've seen in mature and successful organizations that we see as critical success factors for doing this well. So I wanted to start with a broad look at the priorities for knowledge management teams, and this is based on our 2021-2022 KM priorities research. And I've included some 2020 data that we collected right before the COVID-19 pandemic, just so you have that context and historical view. And this is what we saw across our audience. It's mostly KM professionals, but also some external subject matter experts, some business stakeholders and leaders and people like that. So developing and improving KM strategies is always going to be a top objective for KM teams. So it makes sense to see that at the top. But if you look at the next 2 items on this list, the first is identifying, mapping, and prioritizing critical knowledge. And the second is transferring expert knowledge. And I see those 2 as milestones on the same continuum, really, around knowledge transfer. You have to figure out what knowledge is important enough or sufficiently at risk for it to make sense to document it in some format or to pass it directly to other people. And then you have to actually transfer that knowledge, often from your experts, from your experienced people, to your less experienced people, either through a repository or directly from person to person. And this focus on identifying and transferring critical knowledge and expertise ranked higher in priority than a lot of trendier things, whether that's virtual collaboration or content management or even search, though we certainly see a lot of focus in those areas. And so I think the obvious question is why? What is driving this renewed or sustained focus on identifying and transferring critical knowledge? So there's a couple of different reasons, and I've got a bunch of them listed on the slide here. The first is that the workforce is changing rapidly. There's a lot of people moving in and out and around, and that really increases the risk of knowledge loss and the need to spread and replicate critical knowledge beyond maybe an elite group of often older insiders. So the pandemic has really helped a lot of organizations recognize that they had a knowledge risk where something was maybe held by 1 or 2 or 3 subject matter experts. And as things were changing and people were going in and out and people couldn't be together, it really made them realize that they needed to document that knowledge and provide it to a broader group of people and allow them to access that from different locations. We've seen a lot of mergers and acquisitions, reorganizations, all sorts of different churn. And, I think that that always makes organizations realize that they need to document that knowledge. They need to make that available. You don't know when a team is going to be reformulated or the organization is going to shift on a dime. And you really need access to that knowledge. You can't just rely on the heads of one or two people. And then obviously, remote and hybrid work have increased recognition of the need for knowledge transfer. So it's harder to do it organically just in the course of work when you're sitting next to somebody and asking them questions and maybe getting onboarded and mentored in that kind of, informal way. You recognize you need a more structured approach to capture and transfer that critical knowledge. And then the second thing I have on here is around changing skill sets. We've seen a lot of turmoil over the last couple of years, but also a lot of innovation and processes changing, technologies changing, organizational structures changing. So people need new combinations of knowledge in order to do their job. Lots of upskilling and reskilling going on, and knowledge transfer is a big piece of that. And then finally, digital transformation and all things related to it. Organizations are trying to make the most out of things like robotic process automation, machine learning, AI, a whole range of new technologies that really require the organization to understand what it does to define its processes and also to document what it knows, because those systems really thrive on data, including knowledge about how things work in different scenarios and how judgments are made and all those kinds of things. That if you don't have those things documented, if they're only in someone's brain, then they're not on the grid that those systems can analyze, those algorithms. And then we're also seeing some of those new digital technologies really change how you can capture and transfer knowledge in the flow of work. Whether that's identifying knowledgeable people or key documents, or actually harvesting critical knowledge from artifacts like emails or project files or social threads. The technologies may not do it perfectly, but they might get you 60, 70, 80% of the way, and then you can bring a human curation process in to take you that last mile. So I think those are all good reasons why organizations may be prioritizing knowledge transfer right now. I want to spend the rest of the session talking about 5 steps for excellent knowledge transfer. And these are themes that we have seen repeatedly in our research, and in particular that came out of analysis of organizations that have achieved our excellence in KM recognition based on the overall maturity of their KM programs, which we do assess as part of our very comprehensive KM capability assessment tool. So we know these organizations are good at KM, that they have mature, sustainable practices, and we really dig in to find out how that works and how they got there, and try to turn that into some recommendations for other programs to replicate, adapt, and adopt. So here are 5 steps. The first is really around defining processes, roles, and responsibilities for knowledge transfer, so people understand what they're expected to do when, and they have that roadmap. Make knowledge transfer efficient. And typically what we see is that this means offering different tiers or options based on the breadth and the depth of the need. Some things can be really self-service, some things need to be very highly facilitated. So having that spectrum as part of your KM portfolio can be really helpful. The third is around building knowledge and transfer and reuse into daily work. So it's not something extra that employees have to do on top of their jobs. It happens in context as much as possible. And we'll kind of look at how the above the flow of work versus embedded in the flow of work together. And then the fourth is around verifying and institutionalizing outcomes by building the transferred knowledge into business processes, project guides, learning materials, wherever it can make a difference, both in terms of professional development for people who need it and organizational performance. And then finally, measure and demonstrate the impact of knowledge transfer on learning and business outcomes. If you don't show the value, you're very unlikely to get sustained investment and participation. People want to really see that it's what they're doing is making a difference, especially because some of these activities can be very time and resource heavy. So our first step is we're going to talk about this defining knowledge transfer processes and expectations. And some of this may seem pretty obvious, but we find organizations tend to mess it up a lot. You really need to have a clear process for knowledge transfer, a project plan, and that's especially true for large scale, in-depth knowledge transfer efforts. If you ask an expert to, just write down what you know or tell this person what you know without having really clear, definition of how you want them to do that, that can be incredibly overwhelming for people. And then within that, you really need to outline the roles and responsibilities. And that's true for both sources of knowledge, but you may also have some recipients of that knowledge, some facilitators involved in the process, some managers of the people who are involved. All of that needs to be outlined for people. And that allows you to get buy-in and approval from all of your participants and impacted stakeholders, so you don't have any surprises down the road. And we have lots of examples of different knowledge transfer processes and roles if you want to look at some variety. The example I have here is from Air Traffic Navigation Services in South Africa. And this is the only organization in the whole country that handles air traffic control. So obviously they have a fair amount of unique knowledge, and they also have an aging workforce. So they created what they call a legacy program, and this targets experts in their last 5 years of their career before they're, planning to retire. And it's really designed to capture and transfer critical knowledge from those individuals before they leave the organization, so that they can leave a legacy. And the program has a really clear, well-defined process. You can see some of the main steps, and there's lots of detail behind them on the slide here. But I do want to highlight a couple of specific elements. They have a really strong partnership with their HR department to help identify the candidates. That's one of the areas where we see organizations trip up a lot. They don't know who has knowledge that needs to enter into a knowledge transfer process. And HR can really help you both identify those folks and figure out the priority if you can't obviously transfer knowledge from everybody. This second step is, that the KM team really reaches out to the manager of that person and gets that upfront buy-in, upfront agreement for participation. That tends to be really important. And then also the request comes not from this KM team up here, but from your manager. This is something that we would really like you to do and participate in. Agreeing on the scope, scheduled expectations, and potential beneficiaries. That's just the blocking and tackling of a good project plan, really important. And also the tools of engagement there. How are we going to work together? What are the norms, collaboration norms, operating norms of the project? And then I think having access to those experts as part of a follow-up process for the people who are receiving the knowledge and learning from it. So you've got the documentation and also a little bit of time for one-on-one to ask questions, to understand the context where people are coming from. So it has that human element, and it's not just, things on a page. All really critical here. And then also focusing on celebrating these long-term employees and their legacy. The organization creates a story about each expert that gets published in an internal newsletter, promoted on a wiki, and really making sure that those folks understand that you appreciate their contribution, the time that they've taken to capture and transfer that knowledge. And that's all part of the standard process. And you make sure that those things happen and don't fall through the cracks, because that really helps build the culture that understands knowledge transfer as something important that the organization wants to invest in and that, people want to be a part of. So the next step I wanted to talk about is making knowledge transfer efficient. In particular, establishing what I've been calling these tiers of service. So for most organizations, this means having some kind of formal facilitated knowledge transfer, as well as some self-service, maybe quick and dirty approaches to transfer knowledge as work happens, as needs occur. So things that maybe don't go up to the level of that legacy program we looked at on the last example, but where knowledge transfer still really needs to happen, but it might take 30 minutes instead of 3 months. And essentially that formal knowledge transfer that we're looking at sits at the pinnacle, but there are lots of other, maybe less intensive, faster forms of knowledge transfer that have to happen underneath. And making sure that you're looking at that whole picture and not just at that top of the pyramid can be really important. Before we jump into this, I wanted to provide a little bit of context about knowledge transfer as we envision it at APQC. Some people, when they say knowledge transfer, they mean that highly deliberate, facilitated approach to deep knowledge transfer out of an expert's head. But there really are lots of different ways to transfer knowledge in the broader sense. And at APQC, we group them into four main categories. The first is formal elicitation, and those are the kinds of activities we've been talking about. The most common we see are where a facilitator or an expert mid-career professional will sit down and do some interviews with an expert and try to capture some of what they know, how they make decisions, the basis for judgment that they've built over 10, 20, 30 years, as well as just some deep expertise that they have on products and services and processes that maybe hasn't been documented anywhere. But we do also put some process and event-based elicitation in that category. So things like the transfer of best practices, capture of lessons learned. So that's kind of not focused on an individual person and their expertise, but critical knowledge that's coming out of a process, an event, something that went well, something that went wrong that you want to either replicate or prevent from being replicated in the future. And then the second category is really expert and peer-based approaches. And those tend to be a little less structured. You're connecting sources of knowledge with recipients of knowledge in something like a community of practice, a mentoring program, even an enterprise social network, and just letting people ask and answer questions and extract critical knowledge on demand that way. So it's more of a pull approach versus that really strategic push approach. The third category is learning sessions and events. And this may be the most straightforward traditional approach to knowledge transfer back to the Greeks and Romans, where you ask people to transfer their knowledge by leading a training course, presenting on a webinar, maybe facilitating a master class or a workshop. And then finally, you have documentation approaches where you ask somebody with knowledge to try to write it down or record it, or maybe report it through a blog or a wiki or some format like that. But you're asking them to write it down for you. And as we go in and look at some of making knowledge transfer efficient and how some of these different options might play out in real life, I wanted to show this example from Shell. And I do think they do a good job of supporting those different tiers or levels of knowledge transfer. At the higher end of the spectrum, you have that formal knowledge transfer through a retention of critical knowledge or ROC process. You have job transition guides, and then you also have a learning through experience process, which is around lessons learned from events and projects. But then you can see you also have tools for expert and peer-based knowledge transfer in communities. Those are their sign networks, and through expertise location approaches. And for knowledge that can be documented, they have an enterprise wiki, they have single point of access portals, which bring together content across platforms to serve as hubs for some specific topics. And then underpinning that, they have the foundations of a knowledge repository and an enterprise taxonomy, which helps you find all of the knowledge that is captured and transferred through these various capabilities. So as you can see, there are many roads to knowledge, a lot of ways for employees to transfer knowledge, to learn. And what we find is that having all of these options for self-service and organic transfer can really take some of the pressure off those intensive facilitated approaches, which do tend to require more planning, more resources to carry out. So maybe by the time an expert is coming up for retirement, they've already coached and mentored people on some of the basics in the context of their community. They've worked with colleagues to capture some knowledge in the blog or the wiki. So a process like retention of critical knowledge has a basis to work from, and they just need to fill in the gaps rather than starting from scratch. So the third step that I want to talk about here is building knowledge transfer into daily work. And I think this is relatively self-explanatory coming out of the last section. But if you're doing knowledge transfer well, there are always going to be some what we call above the flow activities. So your legacy program, your retention of critical knowledge, you can't do that just in the course of your work. You're probably going to have to sit down in a half-day workshop, in a week-long kind of deep dive project, whatever it looks like. You have those activities that you ask people to take time out of their day to participate in, but both as sources and also as recipients of knowledge. We take time out above the flow of work for learning as well. But we do find that knowledge transfer is easiest to adopt and most effective when you push as much of the transfer as possible into people's daily activities. So it's not this constant drain of this extra project that they have to go shift gears and work on. And that's true for experts and people transferring the knowledge, but it's especially true for the learners, the people who need to absorb and take on the knowledge that's being transferred. So this idea of putting knowledge in the workflow is not specific to knowledge transfer. It's critical to every aspect of knowledge management. And this is some data, again, from our knowledge management trends survey, where we asked people, what was the most important theme for the CAM user experience moving forward? And we included some technology-driven themes like making the experience more anticipatory, probably using AI, or personalized based on personas and past behaviors in the system. So having things be really customized and give you exactly what you need without you having to ask for it. And those are paramount to some CAM programs. But the overwhelming majority of people said that the most important themes were to make the CAM user experience simplified, so less confusing, more intuitive, and also in the flow. So it's embedded directly in work processes and applications. And over, we find that the biggest obstacle to CAM adoption and participation is that employees either aren't aware of it or they don't feel like they have time. So when opportunities to both contribute knowledge and consume knowledge are integrated into things that people are already doing, it's usually an easier sell, and it's a lot more possible to have some of it at least happen organically. It looks organic from the end user perspective, but there's usually some work the KM team is doing on the back end to make that happen. And I wanted to, rather than just showing you in the flow knowledge transfer, because I think we've seen some examples of that, kind of think about how the above the flow transfer and the in the flow transfer fit together and happen as part of a successful process. And the example that I've included here is from Collins Aerospace. And this comes out of a project by the organizational excellence team there to create a centralized knowledge base for quality engineers. And at first, the team tried a more piecemeal in the flow approach, where they asked engineers to participate in process and knowledge mapping and write articles about their roles for the corporate wiki. But it kind of ended up being inefficient, and the documentation wasn't consistent across people, across areas. That piecemeal approach wasn't really working for them. So they shifted to hosting half-day structured workshops, so definitely above the flow of work, to gather stakeholders and capture some of that needed information consistently. And each workshop focused on a process that is performed by quality engineers, and they used a range of tools and techniques to capture what they needed. And as the engineering experts shared, the organizational excellence team was able to turn their knowledge into process maps and RACI charts and wiki articles and other documentation in real time. So it had an instant gratification element that was in the flow of the event, if not in the flow of the actual sort of day-to-day work activities. But where I feel like this team really shined in terms of putting knowledge into the flow of work is in how they designed the recipient side for this knowledge, right? They built a comprehensive quality knowledge base that is organized around processes and functions that quality engineers regularly perform. So engineers can pull relevant knowledge out based on their role and what they're doing. And they also brought in links to standard operating procedures, communities, training, career guidance. So all these things that a new quality engineer or somebody who's taking on a new role, new responsibilities might need, and it's all in SharePoint, which is where people were already working. And then on top of that, they built a lot of relevant knowledge into an onboarding navigator tool for new hires. And that tool has helped shorten time to competency. And by linking users back to the organization's various knowledge systems for more information, it trains employees on this is where this kind of knowledge lives. This is where I go to self-service or to ask questions. So it builds that knowledge sharing culture for learners into the flow of their work, as well as giving them access to some of the documentation that's already been created. So some of the knowledge generated, through lessons learned and knowledge transfer should reshape how employees work, whether it's a best practice that should always be followed or a mistake that should never be repeated. And some outcomes should be vetted by experts and when and where possible, institutionalized into work processes. So this next step is really about that. It's about verifying and institutionalizing the outcomes of knowledge transfer. And I see two main components to this. The first is knowledge that should be built into guidance and learning materials. Okay, we sat down with an expert, we spent a whole bunch of time understanding how they work. How do we build that into training materials for people who maybe are going to come, after this person has retired and they're not going to have direct access to that SME? And then the second piece is when knowledge transfer surfaces something that should either be added or changed to the organization's policies, standard operating procedures, business processes and procedures, to make sure that those things don't just live in a best practice repository or lessons learned repository, but if they really impact the global process or, how we should be doing things, how we should be selecting suppliers, that gets worked back into the core documentation of the organization. And I think we saw a great example of institutionalizing outcomes on the last slide with Rockwell Collins, where they're building the knowledge they capture back into resources and materials for people to do their job. And then we'll look at another example here from Goodyear. So I think that the Collins Aerospace example is really good. This is similar, but maybe a little bit more intentional and formal. Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company has an extensive knowledge mapping, expert mapping process to capture SME knowledge. They always say people don't go to college to learn how to make tires, so they have a lot of deep expertise within the organization that they can't buy from the outside. It's not replicable, so they really need to capture that. And they have a facilitated process. They do those expert interviews. They gather a lot of that knowledge. They have very good facilitators who do that. And then the facilitator helps create something out of that process called a learning journal, which is a guide to train potential successors who might take on that role of the expert whose knowledge is being mapped. And the journal really focuses on articulating all the formal, informal, and on the job training needed for a particular role. And it includes process maps and task details and an index of here's some training courses I would recommend you take, some checklists, really anything that they can make a tool out of from those interviews. And the idea is that it helps the successor get up to speed and also provides a roadmap for competency development. So the journals are used by the successors and also in the organization's technical mentoring program to help mentors coach mentees and assess their progress. So you can see how the knowledge it gets documented and then is immediately used to help train and mentor these up and comers. And it makes sure that it really, gets embedded into the organization and how people work going forward, rather than just being documented and sitting somewhere without providing a lot of value or getting applied in new ways to new teams and people. So the final section that I want to talk about is around demonstrating value. And knowledge transfer activities, especially when you have these elements that are above the flow of work, they do tend, compared to other KM activities, to take a lot of time. They take some resources. There's often some facilitation involved. So not only are you asking a very experienced subject matter expert to take time out, you've also got experienced facilitator involved. Maybe you have some mid-career people who are often very busy who are involved in that. And leaders and participants, everybody involved wants to know that the time that is being spent on those activities is going to be worth it, is going to yield value for the organization. So you need to measure not just those activities, is transfer occurring? Are we writing things down? Are we making videos? Are we having interviews? But that it's actually creating measurable benefits for the business. So if we think about the previous example, not just we created 17 learning journals this year, but we were able to decrease time to competency for new hires and people entering new roles. And Goodyear has actually shown a decrease in time to competency through that process. So you see the learning impact, the business impact of that knowledge transfer work. And then this is an example from Saudi Aramco, which shows how their project management office tracks the impact of knowledge transfer and lessons learned in relation to their project outcomes. So they capture KM benefits analysis in 4 quadrants. And I think that this is helpful as you think about the different ways that you might want to measure. So the first is around activity metrics. So is knowledge being captured and reused across projects? Is it happening? Because if it's not happening, then you're probably not going to get any value. So you do need to look at that. And then the second is around recognition, and that really focuses on anecdotal evidence and success stories. So what are we seeing out in the business that this is creating value? Can we point to some specific projects where we really saw a benefit, even if we can't necessarily assign a cumulative dollar value to it or something like that? And then you get to the cumulative dollar value, right? The bottom 2 are both impact metrics. The organization captures the cost associated with each lesson learned. So if we learned this lesson, how much, cost avoidance are we able to capture, any savings? When those projects, when new projects apply those lessons. And then they also capture the non-financial impacts. So you get that dollar value of we think we saved or avoided this amount of money by transferring these lessons to new projects. And then they also look at, here are the process improvement ideas we got. Here's where we realized we really needed to update how we do business. And they capture that as well. So there may not be a dollar value assigned to that, but it's probably improving quality, improving efficiency, something on the back end. There's a reason why, decreasing risk, there's a reason why they chose to do that. And I think it's good to look at the financial and non-financial measures holistically. because you need all different kinds of data to tell your story. So it's important to have ROI measures if you can get them, but also to look at some of those less tangible benefits, because the numbers always are more powerful with stories, and the stories are more powerful with numbers. You really want to look at them together. And then as you think about what business metrics to align to correlate with, I wanted to just share this last piece of data from our KM Trends research. And these are top business priorities for KM leaders, think it's important to support and measure against right now at the end of 2021. And you can see the top ones are productivity, both personal and process productivity, digital transformation, intelligent enterprise, so supporting those efforts to go digital, to implement new technology, AI. Strategic integration, operating as one organization. So that's a big one for knowledge transfer. If you can learn something or build something in one part of the organization and then transfer that knowledge, across the organization to other parts that can benefit from that knowledge. Organizational agility, I think if you are strategically integrated, then that makes you more agile. You're able to pull knowledge and expertise from across the organization, and then data-driven decision making, innovation, continuous learning. All these things are tied in to knowledge transfer. And I definitely see overall a focus on moving away from just cost savings and quality towards some of these real speed metrics. So allowing individuals and teams and organizations to work faster, more efficiently, to adapt faster to changing business, circumstances. And all of that is important as you think about how you want to transfer knowledge, what knowledge is going to be critical, not just now, but in the future, and how you want to think about knowledge transfer, especially in the flow of work, because I think that's where you can really get the, agility and strategic integration benefits at the business level in real time. Well, thanks so much for joining us. This is just an overview of some of these knowledge transfer best practices. If you want to dig in, if you want to learn more about all of the case examples, if you want to learn more about, our recommendations, we have a whole KM Essentials toolkit on how to transfer knowledge. We also have one on how to identify critical knowledge if you need to go back to that step. We look at all sorts of different tools and approaches for knowledge transfer in those 4 categories that I talked about. You can also look at some of our excellence in KM research and examples of strong knowledge transfer processes. We have some tools and templates like a job handoff template, some basic questions you can use just to get your mind moving about how you might elicit and capture some critical knowledge from experts. So I encourage you to review, dig deeper into the resources that we have at APQC, and please get in touch with us if you have questions or you want to learn more about knowledge transfer or knowledge management.